The wind was a knife through the gaps in the cabin walls, promising another meager night of gnawing hunger. Alara huddled deeper under the thin, scratchy blanket, her arms tight around her two children, Elias and Sarah, small against her body. Their breathing was shallow, their sleep restless, punctuated by soft whimpers that tore at her heart. For weeks, the larder had been bare save for a handful of dried beans and the occasional squirrel she managed to snare. A skill she'd learned only after her husband, Thomas, had left or vanished. She no longer knew which was worse. The truth was a dull ache she kept pushed down, replaced by the sharp, constant need to find food, to keep the fragile warmth in their bodies, to make it through just one more day. The homestead, perched precariously on the edge of nowhere, had been Thomas's dream. A promise of land, a fresh start away from the crowded, judgmental towns. It had turned into her solitary nightmare. The soil was stubborn, the weather cruel, and the nearest neighbor a day's ride away, unfriendly at the best of times. She was alone, isolated, and steadily starving. Despair was a cold knot in her belly, heavier than the hunger. She whispered reassurances to her sleeping children, words she barely believed herself. It will be better tomorrow. We will find something. We will be all right. Lies, whispered into the dark. A sound outside, distinct from the wind. A crunch on the frozen earth, heavy and deliberate. Alara stiffened, every muscle tensing. It wasn't an animal. Too slow, too purposeful. Her hand fumbled for the heavy iron skillet near the hearth, the only weapon she possessed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the silent cabin. Elias stirred, whimpering, and she pressed him closer, her body a shield. The sound continued, moving closer to the cabin. She imagined eyes watching from the darkness, assessing her vulnerability. A woman alone with two small children was an easy target. Fear, sharp and cold, pricked her skin. She had faced down wolves and fought off coyotes, but the thought of another human, unknown and uninvited, brought a different kind of terror. One that whispered of cruelty she understood all too well from the snippets of gossip and harsh words she'd overheard in the rare times she'd gone to the distant town. There was a pause outside the door, a long, agonizing silence. Alara held her breath, the skillet clutched tight. She could hear nothing but her own blood rushing in her ears and the soft, innocent breaths of her children. Then, a low scrape against the door, as if something was being leaned against it. Not a knock, not an attempt to open it. Just presence. Waiting. She stayed frozen, listening, the cold seeping deeper into her bones, promising a night of terrified wakefulness alongside the gnawing hunger. The stranger remained outside, a silent, imposing question mark against the backdrop of her desperate solitude and the relentless, unforgiving wilderness. Who were they? Why were they here? The fear was a suffocating weight, pressing down on her chest, threatening to crush the last vestiges of her fragile hope. She could feel their gaze, though the door was thick wood. It was a silent assertion of power, of intrusion, that left her feeling exposed and utterly helpless. She waited, tense and motionless, until the first gray light began to filter through the small, grimy windowpane. The sound of movement outside had ceased hours ago. Cautiously, skillet still in hand, Alara crept to the window. Frost coated the pane, blurring the view, but she could just make out a shape near the door. Not a person, but something tall and bulky leaning against the wall beside it. Her breath hitched. It looked like a pack, a large one, perhaps with supplies, or maybe weapons. She couldn't tell. The silence was unnerving. Had they left? Were they waiting? She dared not open the door. Elias and Sarah began to stir, their small bodies shivering. Elias mumbled about being cold and hungry, and Alara's heart clenched. She had nothing to give them. The reality of their situation crashed down on her again, stark and brutal. She looked back at the vague shape outside the window. Whoever it was, they hadn't forced their way in during the night, which was something. But the uncertainty was a fresh torment. After what felt like an eternity, driven by the children's soft pleas for food and warmth, Alara made a decision born of desperate necessity. She couldn't stay shut in forever. She had to find a way to feed them, to make a fire without attracting attention. Still gripping the skillet, she approached the door slowly, her ears straining for any sound. Nothing. With trembling hands, she unbarred it just enough to peer outside. The biting morning air hit her face. The shape was indeed a large, weathered pack. Beside it, leaning against the cabin wall, was a long rifle. And standing a short distance away, perhaps 20 paces, was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn, practical clothes that blended into the muted landscape. His face was shadowed by the brim of a wide hat, but she could see a rough beard and a stillness about him that spoke of long endurance. He wasn't looking at her, but scanning the horizon, his posture relaxed yet alert, like a predator resting. Her first instinct was to slam the door shut, to retreat into the dubious safety of the cabin. But the pack, the rifle, they spoke of travel, of capability. And his distance, his lack of direct approach, was different from what she had feared. He was giving her space, observing, not immediately threatening. It was not friendliness, but a kind of neutral patience that was just as unnerving. Who was this man? He looked like he belonged to the harsh land itself, carved from rock and weathered by storms. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Who are you?" Her voice was a reedy whisper against the wind. The man turned his head slowly. His eyes, when they met hers, were a pale, assessing gray, deep-set and showing no discernible emotion. They lingered on her face for a moment, then flickered towards the gap in the doorway, presumably seeing or sensing the children behind her. He didn't move from his spot. His voice, when he spoke, was low and gravelly, quiet despite the wind. "Caleb." Just that. No explanation, no demand. Caleb. A simple name, given without preamble. He didn't ask hers. He didn't ask why she was here alone. He simply waited, his gaze returning to the distance. Alara gripped the skillet tighter, her knuckles white. He hadn't answered any of her real questions. Why was he here? What did he want? His passive presence was a challenge in itself. She couldn't afford to be hospitable, even if he seemed harmless, which she doubted. Harmless men didn't wander the wilderness alone, armed and silent. He remained there for the better part of the morning. Alara stayed mostly inside, peeking through the window, tending to the restless, hungry children. Elias and Sarah were scared, clinging to her skirt whenever she moved near the door. She tried to distract them, telling them stories in a voice she hoped sounded braver than she felt. She rationed the last few beans, boiling them in a dented pot until they were soft enough for the children to eat, watching them swallow each precious bite with aching gratitude. She didn't eat, couldn't stomach it. Outside, Caleb occasionally shifted his weight, his eyes always scanning. At one point, he knelt by his pack and took something out. Alara watched, tense. He produced a piece of jerky and ate it slowly, deliberately, his movements efficient and economical. It was the first food she had seen him consume. He didn't offer any. She hadn't expected him to. Compassion was a luxury the wilderness rarely afforded. As the sun climbed higher, he finally moved. Not towards the cabin, but away from it, walking a wide circle around the clearing. Alara watched him go, her guard still up. He moved with a quiet competence, observing the land, his eyes missing nothing. He stopped by the frozen creek bed, knelt and seemed to examine the ice. Then he moved on, disappearing briefly into the sparse trees before reappearing closer to the edge of her small, neglected field. He wasn't patrolling, not exactly. More like assessing, learning the lay of the land. Her land. The thought pricked at her. What right did he have? This was her struggle, her failure, her desperate attempt to survive. She didn't need a silent, watchful stranger witnessing her slow decline. She needed help, yes, but the kind she couldn't ask for, the kind that cost more than she could ever pay. He returned to his original spot by the door, settling down with his back against the cabin wall, his rifle across his knees. He seemed content to simply wait. It was bewildering. Most drifters either moved on quickly or became immediately demanding. Caleb did neither. He was simply present. A silent, unmoving fixture on her horizon. His patience felt like another burden, another unknown she had to navigate. What was he waiting for? What did he expect? The questions circled in her mind, unanswered, adding to the heavy weight of her fear and desperation. Hours bled into afternoon. Alara tried to work, patching a hole in the roof that let in a draft. But her movements were slow, clumsy with hunger and fatigue. The children were subdued, sensing her fear and the strangeness of the man outside. Sarah, the younger, crawled into her lap and fell into a fretful sleep. Elias sat by the cold hearth, drawing pictures in the dust with his finger. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken worries. Outside, Caleb remained. He hadn't spoken again since giving his name. He hadn't moved significantly. He was just there, a silent, watchful presence. It was unsettling, deeply so, but in a way she couldn't articulate. It wasn't overtly hostile, yet it was a profound disruption to the isolated world she had built around herself and her children. A world of quiet struggle and dwindling hope. His presence felt like a challenge to that world, a forced acknowledgement that she was no longer entirely alone, for better or worse. And in her current state, she suspected it was more likely for worse. The wilderness had taught her that help rarely came without a steep price, and often the price was higher than solitude and hardship. As the light began to fade, deepening the shadows and bringing a fresh bite to the wind, Caleb finally moved with purpose. He rose, stretched slowly, then walked a short distance from the cabin and began to gather deadfall wood. He worked efficiently, snapping branches, his movements economical. He wasn't gathering wood for her hearth, she noted. He carried it back to his spot near the door and began to build a small, contained fire. It was a low fire, not meant to give off much light or attract attention, but simply to provide warmth for one person. He was settling in for the night. The sight of the flickering flames, however small, was a stark contrast to the cold, empty hearth inside her cabin. A silent, visual representation of the divide between them. He had the means to create warmth to sustain himself while she did not. It was another layer to his unsettling presence, not just watchful, but capable in a way she was not, right outside her door. She watched him through the window for a long time. He sat by the fire, silent and still, a silhouette against the dying light. He seemed utterly self-sufficient, a part of the harsh landscape rather than a trespasser upon it. It was a disturbing thought. She had fought so hard against this place, trying to tame it, to make it yield to her will. He seemed to exist within it on its terms. It was a different kind of strength than the one she understood, a quiet resilience that was unnerving precisely because it was so alien to her own frantic, desperate efforts. She finally turned away from the window, her body aching with exhaustion and cold. There was no point in watching him. He was there. That was the reality. She had to focus on her children, on surviving the night. She banked the dying embers in the hearth, trying to coax out every last bit of warmth, a futile effort. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and the children, listening to the wind howl, to the occasional snap of the fire outside, and to the silent, steady presence of the man named Caleb, waiting in the dark just beyond her door. His watchfulness felt less like a threat now, and more like a heavy, inexplicable burden she didn't know how to carry or how to cast off. It was a profound intrusion, a silent demand she couldn't understand. The next morning brought no change. Caleb was still there, tending his small fire, distant but present. The sight of him was becoming a strange kind of constant in her chaotic, unpredictable life. Alara went about the motions of her day, such as they were, checking the snares, finding them empty again, searching the frozen ground for any signs of roots or berries, finding only ice and dead leaves. The hunger was a dull roar now, making her movements slow and clumsy, clouding her thoughts. She was attempting to repair the broken handle of her water pail, fumbling with frozen fingers and a length of twine, when she heard a different sound. Not the wind, not Caleb's quiet movements. A sharper sound like wood being split. She looked towards the small stand of trees near her cabin, where she kept the meager supply of firewood Thomas had left. Caleb was there. He had picked up her old, dull axe, the one she struggled to use, the head loose on the handle. He hefted it, tested the balance, then began to chop. His movements were fluid, powerful. Each swing was precise, sinking deep into the wood with a satisfying thud. Logs split cleanly, efficiently. He worked with an economy of motion she had only ever seen in men who knew the wilderness, who understood the physics of labor, who had strength born of hard use. He worked for perhaps an hour, reducing the small pile of logs to neat stacks of firewood. Then he stopped, leaned the axe against a stump, and returned to his spot by the cabin, settling back down near his fire. He hadn't spoken a word. He hadn't looked at her directly. He had simply taken on a task she struggled with, completed it with effortless competence, and returned to his silent vigil. It was bewildering. It was infuriating. It was helpful. Her mind reeled. Why? Why would he do that? It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was undeniably useful. She needed that wood desperately, but accepting it felt like acknowledging a debt she couldn't repay, opening a door she wasn't sure she wanted opened. The wood sat there, a silent offering, a challenge. Later that day, hunger finally overcame her pride and fear. Elias was shivering uncontrollably, his lips blue. Sarah was quiet, too quiet. She had to make a fire. She had to use the wood. With a heavy heart, she ventured outside. She kept her eyes fixed on the woodpile, avoiding looking at Caleb, who sat still as a stone statue near his fire. She approached the neatly stacked wood, her hands trembling as she picked up a few pieces. The wood felt solid, real, a promise of warmth. As she gathered the wood, she heard a faint sound, closer now. Caleb had shifted. She didn't look up. Then he cleared his throat, a low rumble. Snow coming. Alara froze. She looked up at the sky. It was the same leaden gray it had been for days. But now, yes, there was a thickness to the air, a heavy stillness that often preceded a storm. She hadn't noticed, lost in her own misery and the children's needs. He had noticed. He saw things she missed. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. She nodded, unable to find her voice. She clutched the wood and hurried back inside, her heart pounding. She started the fire, coaxing the flames to life with tinder and kindling. The warmth spread slowly, filling the small cabin, chasing away some of the damp chill. Elias and Sarah huddled close, their faces turning towards the heat like small flowers seeking the sun. Watching their immediate relief, the way their bodies relaxed, a wave of gratitude washed over her. Gratitude for the fire, for the wood, for the silent, strange man who had provided it. It was a dangerous feeling, this gratitude towards a stranger she didn't understand. It chipped away at the walls she had built around herself. Over the next few days, Caleb continued his silent, inexplicable presence. He didn't attempt to enter the cabin, didn't speak unless it was a brief, functional observation, critter was near the stream, or fence needs mending. But he continued to work, methodically improving things. He sharpened her axe until the blade gleamed, making chopping wood a far less exhausting task for her. He repaired the section of fence he'd mentioned, his hands capable and quick. He seemed to possess an endless supply of small, practical skills she lacked. He also began to hunt, not with her ineffective snares, but with his rifle. He brought down a rabbit one morning, cleaned it efficiently near his fire, and then, without a word, left half of it near her door before retreating to his usual spot. Alara stared at the meat, tears welling in her eyes. Real meat, a true meal for her children. It was another offering, another silent demand she couldn't understand. Why was he doing this? What did he expect in return? The suspicion was still there, the wariness, but it was warring now with a desperate, growing hope. She took the meat inside, cooked it slowly over the fire, savoring the smell. Elias and Sarah ate until their bellies were full, their faces smeared with grease, their laughter light and free for the first time in weeks. Watching them, Alara felt a fierce surge of protectiveness, and alongside it, a reluctant softening towards the man outside. He wasn't just watching her starve. He was preventing it. He wasn't just present. He was providing. She still didn't fully trust him. How could she? She knew nothing about him, where he came from, why he was here. He was a soldier, she guessed, from the way he moved, the way he handled the rifle, the quiet watchfulness in his eyes. Soldiers carried burdens, carried violence. But he had directed none of it towards her or her children. Only quiet competence and unexpected, silent charity. She found herself watching him more openly now, observing his routines. He rose with the sun, built his fire, ate his meager breakfast, then worked on some small task around the homestead, fixing a loose shutter, clearing brush, repairing a faulty hinge. He seemed to find things that needed doing, things she hadn't even noticed or had given up on. In the afternoons, he would often go out hunting, returning sometimes with small game, sometimes empty-handed, but always with that same quiet, enduring presence. She started leaving water out for him in a clean bucket she had scrubbed. She didn't announce it. She just did it. He would drink from it when she wasn't looking, a silent acknowledgement of her small gesture. One evening, after he had shared a bird he'd shot, she baked the last of her flour into a small, flat bread. It wasn't much, but it was something. She left half of it near his fire before retreating inside. In the morning, it was gone. Slowly, hesitantly, a routine formed between them. Not of conversation, but of presence and quiet exchange. He provided meat or wood. She provided water or the occasional piece of bread if she could spare it. It was a fragile, unspoken agreement, built on mutual need and his inexplicable willingness to help. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity and a deep, guarded gratitude. Her children, sensing her easing tension, became less afraid of the quiet man outside. Elias would sometimes peek out the window at him, and Caleb, if he noticed, would offer a fractional nod before returning to his task. One afternoon, a sharp crack echoed through the air. Alara startled, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the sound of a rifle shot, too close for comfort. She rushed to the window, scanning the trees. She saw Caleb, standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle raised. He lowered it slowly, looking towards the ground. He was a rough-looking man, someone she didn't recognize, but his posture spoke of unwelcome intent. He stared towards the cabin, then his gaze settled on Caleb standing there, rifle in hand, a silent, unmoving guardian. After a long moment, the rider turned his horse slowly and rode away, disappearing back into the trees. Alara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Caleb hadn't spoken a word, hadn't even shouted a warning. He had simply shown the rifle, shown his willingness to use it, and the threat had retreated. It was a stark demonstration of his purpose here. He wasn't just helping her survive the elements. He was protecting her from something else, something human. She stepped outside, needing to speak, to acknowledge this unspoken act of defense. Caleb was cleaning his rifle, his back to her. The air felt thick with unspoken words. "Thank you," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. He paused his cleaning but didn't turn. "Ryder," he said, his voice flat, "looked like trouble." "He was," Alara confirmed, thinking of the predatory look in the man's posture. I don't get many visitors." Caleb finally turned, his gray eyes meeting hers. There was something unreadable in them, a weariness perhaps, but also a quiet resolve. "You're alone," he stated, not as a question but a simple fact. Alara nodded, hugging herself against the chill. "My husband. He left." She hadn't said those words aloud to anyone before. The admission felt raw, exposing. Caleb held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "This is hard country for a woman alone," he said, his voice low. It wasn't pity, but a simple statement of truth. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's all I have. For my children." He looked towards the cabin, towards the small figures visible through the window. A flicker of something, understanding, recognition, crossed his face, gone before she could identify it. He didn't speak of his own past, of why a former soldier was wandering alone, ending up on her doorstep. And she didn't ask. The silence stretched between them, but it felt different now. Less wary, more acknowledged. They were two solitary people, bound together by circumstance and the harsh reality of their existence. His presence was no longer just unsettling. It was a shield. Over the following weeks, the shift in their dynamic deepened. Caleb didn't move into the cabin, maintaining a physical distance, but his integration into the life of the homestead became undeniable. He helped Alara mend the roof properly, his strength and knowledge making quick work of a task that would have taken her days. He showed her how to reinforce the animal pen, how to identify tracks, how to set snares more effectively. He taught Elias how to whittle simple toys and Sarah how to skip stones in the partially frozen creek, small acts of normalcy that felt profoundly healing. Alara, in turn, found herself talking to him more. Hesitantly at first, sharing small details about her life before the homestead, the reasons they had come here, the slow erosion of her hopes. She spoke of Thomas, not with bitterness, but with a quiet sadness, admitting the loneliness that had settled in long before he physically left. Caleb listened more than he spoke, offering brief, non-judgmental responses. Sometimes, she would catch him watching her and the children, his expression thoughtful, his eyes carrying a depth of experience she could only guess at. One evening, as they sat by their separate fires, hers inside, his outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow. The sky was dark and heavy. It was going to be a bad storm. Alara felt the familiar prickle of fear, but it was tempered now by Caleb's presence. She knew he wouldn't leave. Just as the first flakes began to fall, large and soft, landing on the cold ground, she heard a new sound. Not the wind, not the snow. Hoofbeats. Many of them. Approaching fast. Alara's blood ran cold. Riders. Not one but several. And they were riding hard, heading directly for her cabin. She looked out the window towards Caleb's fire. He was already standing, his rifle in his hands, facing the direction of the sound. His posture was taut, ready. There was a shout from the darkness, rough and demanding. "Open up. We know you got folks in there." It was the same rough voice from the rider Caleb had turned away weeks ago, joined by others. They hadn't forgotten. They had come back, likely emboldened by numbers. Alara felt a wave of raw panic. She grabbed her children, pulling them close, shielding them with her body. She was trapped. "Alara!" Caleb's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the storm and the approaching noise. It was the first time he had ever used her name. It felt like a command, a reassurance, a bond forged in that instant. "Stay inside. Keep the children back." She heard him move, his footsteps crunching in the deepening snow as he moved away from the cabin, towards the edge of the clearing where the riders would emerge. He was drawing them away from her door. He was facing them alone. The riders burst from the trees, dark shapes against the falling snow, their faces grim and hard in the pale light filtering through the clouds. 3 of them. They reined in their horses when they saw Caleb standing there, a lone figure in their path, his rifle aimed steadily. "Get out of the way, soldier," the leader snarled, pulling his own weapon. "We ain't looking for trouble with you. We want what's in that cabin." "You ain't getting in," Caleb said, his voice low and steady, devoid of fear. "Oh yeah? You think you can stop all 3 of us?" Another rider jeered, fanning out. Alara watched from the window, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She couldn't just hide. She had to do something. She looked around frantically, her eyes landing on the axe, sharpened by Caleb's hand. It was useless against guns, but it was something. Something to defend herself and her children if they broke through. Outside, the tension was a palpable thing, thick with the falling snow. The leader shifted in his saddle. "Last chance, friend. Step aside." "No," Caleb replied, his stance unwavering. The leader cursed and raised his rifle. But Caleb was faster. The crack of his rifle split the air. The leader cried out, clutching his shoulder, his rifle falling to the ground. The other two riders hesitated for just a fraction of a second. It was all Caleb needed. He moved with astonishing speed, dropping the rifle, drawing a knife, and lunging towards the nearest rider's horse, spooking it. Chaos erupted. Horses reared and whinnied in the snow. The remaining two riders were thrown off balance. Caleb, moving like a wraith in the swirling snow, engaged the men hand to hand. Alara watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the silent man she had come to rely on unleashed the violence he carried within him. It was brutal, efficient. He fought with a quiet ferocity, honed by experience. One rider fell quickly, incapacitated. The other, the one who had jeered, was younger, faster, but clearly outmatched. There was the glint of steel, a grunt of pain, and then silence, save for the wind and the snorting of horses. Alara stumbled outside, unable to stay inside any longer. The scene was stark in the snow. Two men lay still on the ground. The leader was slumped against his horse, gripping his bleeding shoulder. Caleb stood over the third man, his knife in hand, his face grim. He looked up as Alara approached, his expression shifting slightly as his eyes met hers. The raw intensity faded, replaced by that familiar, quiet assessment. "It's done," he said, his voice flat. Alara looked at the bodies, the blood staining the white snow. It was horrific, but a wave of relief, profound and overwhelming, washed over her. He had protected them. He had killed for them. The reality of it was staggering. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice shaky. He shook his head. "Just scrapes." He looked at the two downed men. "They won't be back." He turned his attention to the wounded leader. "You get outta here. You tell anyone what happened. Anyone comes looking. I'll find you." His voice was cold, final. The wounded man, pale with pain and fear, nodded mutely, struggled back onto his horse, and rode off into the storm, leaving his companions behind. Caleb watched him go, then turned back to the clearing, his gaze sweeping the perimeter. He retrieved his rifle, checked the bodies of the other two men. Dead. He began the grim task of dragging them away, towards the trees. Alara stood frozen, watching him. He was doing what needed to be done, the harsh necessities of this life. The man who had silently helped her survive the cold and the hunger had just saved her from a more immediate, brutal threat. Her fear of him was gone, replaced by awe, gratitude, and a deeper, more complex understanding. He was capable of terrible things, yes, but that capability had been turned outwards in their defense. She finally moved, going inside for her shovel, the one Caleb had repaired. She returned and began to help him, digging shallow graves in the frozen earth under the swirling snow. They worked in silence, the only sounds the scraping of the shovels and the wind. It was hard, backbreaking work, but necessary. It was a shared burden, a grim task that bound them together in a way words never could. As they finished burying the men, the snow began to ease. The wind died down. The world felt hushed, still. Alara leaned on the shovel, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body aching. She looked at Caleb. He was cleaning his knife in the snow, his face impassive. "Why?" she asked, the question finally escaping her lips. "Why did you stay? Why did you help us?" Caleb looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. He wiped the blade clean, then sheathed it. He hesitated for a long moment, considering his words. "Saw you," he said simply. "Alone. With the children," he paused. "Reminded me of things." He didn't elaborate, and Alara didn't press. The few words were enough. They hinted at a past, at losses, at a depth she had only glimpsed. He hadn't helped her out of grand heroism, but out of a quiet recognition of shared vulnerability, a silent understanding of what it meant to be alone in a harsh world, to fight for something precious. He looked at the cabin, at the faint light spilling from the window where her children slept soundly now, safe. Then he looked back at her, standing exhausted but resolute in the snow. "This place," he said, gesturing vaguely at the homestead, "needs work, needs watching." It wasn't a proposal, not in the way she understood the word. It was a statement of fact, a quiet offering of his capability, his watchfulness. A suggestion of a future built not on romance or grand promises, but on shared work, mutual need, and the quiet understanding forged between them in the face of hardship and violence. Alara looked at her hands, raw and sore from digging. She looked back at the cabin, her children inside. She looked at Caleb, standing before her, a figure carved from resilience and quiet strength. She had come here alone, broken and afraid, facing starvation and despair. Now, she stood in the aftermath of violence, bone-weary but strangely resolute, not alone. She raised her head, meeting his steady gaze. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wouldn't face it alone anymore. Not if he stayed, and she hoped he would. "Yes," she said, her voice low but clear. "It does." It wasn't a question or an answer about feelings. It was an agreement, an acceptance of the unspoken partnership he was offering. A commitment to building something from the broken pieces of her life, not alone, but together. There was no grand declaration of love, no sweeping promises of a new life built easily. It was harder, more real than that. It was the quiet decision to face the relentless wilderness, the potential threats, the daily struggle side by side. His presence was no longer a mystery to be feared, but a foundation upon which to build. And Alara, the woman who had been brought to her knees by hardship, felt a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer just a mother on a starving homestead. She was a woman standing on the edge of a new beginning, facing the dawn with a quiet soldier by her side, ready to build a life not of dreams, but of enduring reality.